I was born in Tamworth, New South Wales, on the 20th day of the 5th month in the Common Era of 1955. I was born to Bruce and Beryl Smith. When I was 10 years old, I had 4 sisters, and my mother was pregnant with a 5th, or would have been a 6th child, but it turned out to be a 5th girl. And at that time, she, in my words and my way of thinking, she gave us away to an orphanage. And I say she gave us away because there was no discussion at the time. We weren't told what was happening. Basically, we were bundled into a car, driven from Tamworth to Armidale to the Catholic orphanage at Armidale, and surrendered to the nuns. And I was very angry because I didn't know what was going on. Nothing had been explained to me, and all of a sudden, my whole living circumstance had changed. And it was quite a traumatic shock to me to suddenly find, I'd been living in the same house for 10 years, sleeping in the same bed for 10 years, and then to one day find that that's all gone. It was a Catholic orphanage, which basically meant that the boys went one way and the girls went the other way. So, in effect, I was estranged from my sisters for that period in the orphanage. I was in the orphanage for about 16 months before Mum actually came and collected us again. For myself, it was too late by then. The damage had been done in our relationship. I blamed my mother for all the things that had happened to me in the orphanage, and that was quite a bit. So I wasn't exactly the best behaved child in the orphanage. And that stems from the anger and the resentment that I had about my situation. I experienced complete confusion, absolute confusion. I mean, I was 10 when I went in. I had my 11th birthday in there. When I sort of reflect back on that, my memories, my trauma was so deep, and the confusion of the moments so chaotic that my recollections are not all that clear. Having said that, I do have some very clear recollections. For example, one of the strongest recollections I have is that I made friends with the first Australian boy that was in there, Gussie Nichols. And he was a little bit younger than me, perhaps, but we told good stories together, and I really enjoyed his company. I really looked forward to playing with him and sharing time with him, until one day he just disappeared. To this day, I don't know where he is. I've as a researcher, I've tried to find him, but to no avail. He was there one morning when we woke up, and we went through the usual morning degrading routine, which was we stand by our beds, and anyone that wet the bed had to drag their sheets out while everybody looked at them, and little bit of an exhibit was made of them. Um, and so he was there. When I got back from school, because we were carred in to school in town, Gussie wasn't. He was never privileged enough to go to school. So I guess being an Indigenous person, he wasn't afforded that privilege. But when I got back from school in the afternoon, he was no longer there, and I've never seen him since. I've never, to this day, seen him or heard of him. So that's a little piece of unfinished memory that I have. There's no closure around that, and that to this very day it still causes a little bit of grief every time I think about that. I hated being in the orphanage, and so although I was often told I was stupid and dumb and an idiot and all these labels that were placed on me, I would sit around, and sometimes with Gussie and sometimes by myself. I would sit around and I would plot how I was going to escape. And to me, this became a really serious and important game. And I'd heard of this place called Queensland, and the sun used to shine all the time in Queensland, and I don't know if you've ever been to Armidale, but it's very cold in Armidale in the winter. It snows in Armidale, and I'm not a big fan of the cold. I never have been. So this place in this Queensland place sounded like somewhere that I should be. So, and I knew it was kind of in that direction. So I would plan, each week I would plan to escape, and I would escape probably 3-4 times a month, only to be caught by the constabulary, chastised and sometimes beaten by the constabulary, and then returned to the nuns where I was punished for my actions. So I spent quite a bit of time in punishment. Some of the punishments included being locked in the closet under the stairs. I wasn't allowed out on excursions. Other kids would go on excursions and things like that, but I was a flight risk, so I was never allowed out on excursions. For me, it was either school or the orphanage, and that was it. Many of the other kids sort of went to people's places for a weekend, or and they had sort of respite from the constant droll of the orphanage. I could have been termed an official absconder, truant, delinquent. The state never interfered, even though I was quite regularly picked up. Well, every time I did escape, I was picked up by the police. So, but there was never an official report put in. I'm not sure why. I suspect it was because my mother was paying a certain amount of money to the orphanage. If not my mother, perhaps my father. I'm not sure. I don't have that evidence. I did try and investigate these things, but when I wrote and asked for my records of being in the orphanage, it came back and there were only 2 lines: date admitted, date released. And they were my records for 16 months in an orphanage. I do know that there were a couple of medical issues that I had in the orphanage and dental issues as well, because I had pretty much, look, my recollection is that one of the nuns took a swing at me and I tried to duck it and fell down some stairs and broke a tooth. So there were dental repairs there, but that's not on my report. So I do know that there were quite serious medical and dental issues during my time in there, but they've never been recorded. The same with my sisters. It's just 2 lines. Well, actually, a few more. They're just the name, and then date admitted, date released. And that's it. During that 16 months in the orphanage, I could see my sisters. They were over there. I could always see them over there. But the boys were not allowed to interact with the girls. So I never got to talk to my sisters or play with my sisters. And that actually had a lifelong, profound effect on our relationship, because it established separation. It broke that bond that we had. When we went to the orphanage, my sisters were my life. They were the only consistent presence within my life that were not hurting me. Yep. So we were born into domestic violence, alcoholism, and there was all that trauma around. And my sisters were the only safe space that I had. And then when we went to that orphanage and we were separated, I lost that safe space. I lost the only people that I could talk to about what was happening in my world. And so that changed the way that I thought, it changed the way I saw people, it changed my life forever, it changed the direction of my life. It would have been 16 months after we were admitted. We were told, well, I was told that day that I wouldn't be going to school. I wasn't told why, I just was told I wouldn't be going to school. I thought I'd done something wrong again. But as it happened, through the course of the day, my mother turned up and pretty much reunited me with my sisters, and we drove on. I was very angry with my mother. I was very, very angry with my mother. I was very happy to be reunited with my sisters. We went, I don't remember a lot about the ensuing few months. I know that I got into a lot of trouble and I kept trying to run away because I didn't want to be with her anymore. I didn't trust her. I didn't know that I didn't trust her. I hadn't been able to understand those feelings and emotions and things like that. I hadn't got to that stage of my formative years. But today on reflection, like back then I just didn't want to be around her. I didn't like her anymore. Today I understand I didn't trust her. And so I did the same as I was doing in the orphanage. I was trying to run away all the time. She would ring the police. So in effect, my mum was responding in the same way that the orphanage did, and notifying the authorities that I'd gone missing, having them locate me, bring me back, and then I'd be punished at home as well. So this was just a continuance of that behaviour, and then that evolved. I started to steal things when I'd run away, milk money, knickknacks, just things. And I got caught. I went to children's court. Then I was placed in the care of a family, so I was effectively became a state ward. There were social work reports put in there describing my mum as a really nice person, and it's a shame that she had to put up with such behaviour, things like this. Another part of what that was that mum was the victim because her husband was drinking all the time and was violent, and so she was managing the children as best she could under these very heavy circumstances, things like this. So I found myself ward of the state and sent, I was put in foster care. I was 12 years old when I was placed in foster care, and the home I was placed in was in Greenacre in Sydney. It was a very different world to what I was accustomed to. Again, there's an assumption. There's just an assumption that the child accepts the surrounds and will comply to the demands of these strangers that I'd never seen before. And then, when I start acting out, people will start to, blame me. Nobody took the time to explain to me what's going on. In all my youth, nobody ever took that time to explain to me what's going on. Nobody ever asked me what it was like. Having said that, later on when I was in state care, I was given a very special label for the way that I felt, reflecting the way I felt. And that label was sociopath. So, I was deep in trauma. I had a lot of trauma as a child. And that trauma effectively shut down my ability to respond emotionally to a lot of things. I became very introverted, very reserved, very, very angry. And I was just as likely to strike out as anything else. Because I was beginning to lose control of my anger. It was escalating from anger to rage. And that's a very dangerous place for that to be. So I was dragged before the state psychiatrist in New South Wales, and the state psychiatrist, upon asking me a couple of questions, the content of which is very vague in my mind at the moment, very graciously handed me the label of sociopath without any investigation, without any consideration of my past, or my experiences. I guess the confusion was at that time, trauma had not really been investigated. It hadn't really been described. And it was only through the Vietnam veterans returning that we started as a society and as a profession, we started to look at what was happening with them. And, trauma was identified, post-traumatic stress disorder was identified. The person that diagnosed me as a sociopath didn't have those understandings. And I guess at that time, you just sort of reached into the bag of labels and grabbed the closest appropriate one and hung it on a person. And I got sociopath. The interesting thing about having a label like sociopath is that uh, there's a duality of emotion here. In some sense, I was relieved because all of a sudden I knew what was wrong with me, because I didn't know what was wrong with me. I was just always angry. When I get into a fight, I was actually quite vicious. I didn't consider for one moment compromise or mercy or anything, nothing like that entered my mind. And I felt that I needed to be like that because I was smaller than a lot of the kids coming in. So my tactic was surprise, hit hard, hit fast, and hit relentlessly. Do not take a backward step. And that worked very well for me. And usually I would only have to do that once or twice, and people would stay away from me. And that was the objective. The objective was to keep the other kids away from me. I didn't want to be a part of it. And I didn't want to be picked on or bullied. Protecting myself in a very preemptive way. So get in first, get it sorted, sit down. I used the label quite effectively to warn kids off. So the message, I was given the opportunity to give people a warning. Don't mess with me, I'm a sociopath. Whereas prior to that, it would be just hit, get it done. Yep. Now I had a mechanism by which I could give people a warning. Don't mess with me, I'm a sociopath. And that, in that way, if they messed with me, it was their fault. So the same tactics, surprise, fast, hard, and relentless. Same tactics, just, they've had their warning. It was survival in those places. It really was survival. And to be honest, most of the kids were quite callous, cruel and callous. And I have no regrets today. I did have regrets for a while until I sort of sat down and spoke about these with someone else. And through that conversation, I came to understand that although the behaviour was inappropriate, it wasn't necessarily uncalled for. So there's a very warped sense of rationalising the behaviour. I need to be comfortable with that. One of the reasons I need to be comfortable with that today is because if I'm mentoring a young person who displays those anger traits, I need to be able to communicate with them and talk to them and share my experiences with them as well. After the orphanage, and I only had one foster home experience, I think they became wary of the foster home experience with me after the first one. So after the foster home experience, I went straight into punitive care. Punitive care was a boys' home, quite literally, under lock and key 24/7. Very rigid military type discipline. It was in these places that I learned to march. First one I went to, I spent my days with a diamond tip crowbar, smashing rocks all day. And I mean, first week my hands were bleeding. We didn't have gloves or anything. We had to, my hands red raw and bleeding. I didn't try to abscond from these places. What I did do again was I would get into a lot of fights. So I would end up in solitary confinement quite often. Termed unprivileged. And an unprivileged boy in one of these punitive systems basically you stand for your meals. You're not allowed to sit down. From the time you get out of bed in the morning until the time you go to bed in the evening, you are not allowed to sit down. So you stand for everything, including your meals. You get a very basic meal, no desserts, no bread and butter, just a very simple, basic meal. When the other kids you're not allowed to talk to anyone, period. If you talk to anyone, that can be seen as an adverse. That's what it was called, an adverse. And you could end up in solitary confinement for 24 hours. Solitary confinement was a concrete cell with no windows and a steel door with a drop-down viewing hole that was locked. So you were enclosed in this. I spent quite a lot of time in those cells. After a while, I actually came to enjoy being in the cell. By over a period of time, I'd learned to disassociate, so I could construct different realities in my mind, and I could live in those realities. Those realities that I constructed were much more preferable to the what I deemed the torture. Another great gift for the unprivileged there was the scrubbing of the ablutions every night. So you'd be on your hands and knees with a scrubbing brush for hours, just scrubbing ablutions, cleaning grease traps. I entered that type of care at about the age of 14, maybe 15, I'm not quite sure, I'd have to check my records. I know that I exited state care 1 week before my 19th birthday. On my exit from that system, I was called up. I was told that I was to be released. I was the oldest person in the system by almost a year. Most other people were released at age 18. They were either transferred to an adult prison or released. For some reason, I felt very special and privileged. They kept me there until I was almost 19. They called me up. They gave me $2.25, some second-hand clothes, and some advice. Don't come back. I was expected to go out into society and function. I had no idea. I was so afraid. All of a sudden, this disciplined regime that I'd been in had disappeared. And I was in this world that I had no understanding of. And I was nearly 19 and I was expected to make a life for myself. During the time that I was in there, I was educated to the equivalent of year 6, I think it is, in primary school. I did try to go back to school when I was 19, which was very difficult. But I mean, when I say I tried to go back, I was smoking, drinking. I had no chance. But it's interesting that I tried, or that I had that desire to give it a go, even though it failed. There's always been that desire to educate. I've always understood the knowledge of being, or the wisdom of being educated. That knowledge is power. What sort of power it is, that's up to the education that you receive and how you use it. Well and deep into my addiction. So when I say addiction, this was drugs and alcohol, heroin, cocaine, rampant addiction. I was living in King's Cross, Paddington. I did manage to hold a job, albeit a storeman's job, very basic, turn up for work with severe hangovers and sort of still stoned from the night before and using a little bit of cocaine to get through the day and a little bit of amphetamine to get through the day. I was working at Ultimo, and across the road was I think at the time it was a TAFE college, the Ultimo TAFE college. I think it's a UTS now. And I saw a notification there for some night classes. So I enrolled in the night classes. And there was actually, I was very serious at the time. I was very sick at the time, physically, spiritually and emotionally, mentally sick. But I still had that deep-seated desire to learn, buried right down inside me. And I went off to these night classes, and I was there. I stuck it out, for the first assessment task, and the tutor knew that I was on drugs because I'd handed my first essay in. I got it in on time, and I chose to do an essay on feral cats and the damage of feral cats. And everybody got their paper back, and I didn't get mine back. And they'd all left, and I was asked to stay back for a moment. So I did. I stayed back, and the tutor had my paper in his hand, and he said to me, he said, "Gregory, I don't know what your future holds, but whatever you do, don't stop trying to learn." And he gave me my paper, and it had lots and lots of spelling mistakes, like the correction was just red all over. Yeah, but I got a 90 out of 100. During the course of my aftercare life, as troubled and as mixed up as I had or I was, and as much emotional pain that I was carrying, there was always someone in the background that was willing to just throw in a gem of wisdom, or give me a little bit of a guiding light. I never ever noticed. I never ever noticed. And what I did do was I seen these people as dangerous, interferers, interlopers. They just stay away from me. It wasn't until much after that I could look in hindsight and appreciate the value of guidance that I've had over the years. All those seeds were planted. And life, the pain of life, was the fertilizer that helped them mature, and they weren't ready to be harvested until I'd actually come through the other side and gone through a recovery process, started to change my life around, leave the drugs and the alcohol behind and start to clear my mind. There's one thing I'm sure of, without any reservation of doubt whatsoever. If I hadn't changed my lifestyle, if I hadn't have looked at myself and started to implement measures to change the direction of my life, I would not be here today. 22 years ago, I walked out of a forest that I'd been hiding in for 10 years. I'd been hiding in that forest because I couldn't function in society, and I'd given up. I quite literally didn't want to be a part of something that was just causing me more and more pain, something that generated so much shame and stigma in me. I was carrying so much self-loathing from not being able to function in society because I'd never learned. I went into this forest and I stayed in there, and I often say I stayed in there with myself, for myself, by myself. You know, but what I did, and I didn't realize it at the time, is I gave myself an opportunity to invest time, a commodity that we measure so critically today, and we put such value on it today. And I gave myself all this time away from society to have a look at myself, to explore who I was, to spend that time with myself, get to know myself, you know, the good parts, the bad parts, the bits I hate. There wasn't anything I really liked, so that, you know, cut it pretty short. Having said that, it sort of highlighted the gaps, and there was lots of work that I could do. In short, my objective was to die in the forest, and I would have been quite happy with that. That would have been the end of the pain. Unfortunately, I lost an argument with some aliens. A psychosis had set in by this time from all the drugs and the alcohol that I was consuming. But these aliens came, and it's a bit of a long story, I won't go into it, but basically they put a proposition to me, and the proposition was, okay, you want to die in the forest. We're here, nothing wrong with that. Respectable goal in anyone's standards. But you say that you don't want to hurt anyone else anymore. You've hurt too many people in your life, and you don't want to fight anymore, and you don't want to hurt anyone anymore. I said, yes, that's right. They said, well, if you die in the forest, you've got all your sisters, your family, and they may never have closure. Imagine the pain that would cause them. You would be hurting them. That hurt me right there and then. And in that moment, the aliens lost. The condition of this discussion was that if I lost the debate, I was to go and give society another chance. So with my head hung low, than it usually was, I picked up my few meagre possessions, packed them into a black plastic bag, cleaned up the campsite, and walked back into town, where I was going to give society another chance. The painkillers that I'd been using, drugs and alcohol, the way of life that I had been living, anger, hatred, resentment, contempt, shame, stigma, all burdened me to a point that I couldn't carry it any longer. I just couldn't bear it any longer. So I was brought to my knees. I ended up in hospital. I couldn't stay in the hospital because it had walls, and I was no longer accustomed to having walls around me. So I ended up in as an outpatient. We agreed to some terms, but what had happened is the social workers there established my identity, and I was placed on a disability support pension, which gave me an income, but I mean, at that time I was still very sick, and the first thing I did as a homeless addict, alcoholic is, I've suddenly got all this money. So, I go out and buy myself a new haversack and fill it up with drugs and alcohol. A couple of days later, I'm sitting in a park bench at the back of the hospital, or a hospital, and I'm sitting there, and, it's a nice sunny day in February, and I'm thinking to myself, I'm reflecting just on things, and I'm thinking, if I had just one person that I could tell all my problems to, I'd be okay. That was not a good thought for the loneliest man in the world. Because in that moment, I remembered my childhood before I went into the orphanage. And before I went into the orphanage, I had all these passionate dreams about growing up, about being a fireman, about being successful. You hear about all these stories, when you're a child and you want to be like that, or you want to be like that, and you want to have this. I don't remember once thinking I want to grow up and be a lonely old man sitting on a park bench with a bag full of drugs and alcohol, homeless. I don't remember thinking that at all. And I was sitting there and I reflected in, and I remember that passion for life that was burning in my gut when I was younger. It was like a flame for life. And I looked in there at that spot there and then, and it was almost gone. That flame had almost gone. It was just a bare burning ember, and I just wanted to reach in and put it out. And in that moment, I became aware that I was standing. I couldn't see past my nose, and I was ready for the next fight. I was very tired, I was very angry, but I was still ready for the next fight. And all of a sudden this fog started to recede, and I could suddenly see my arms and then my hands. And in my hands I was holding this great big double-edged sword. And then this fog receded further, and I was holding that sword in a fighting position, and I was standing there. And as the fog receded further, I could see all this devastation, all this turmoil and destruction all around me. I couldn't see anyone. I couldn't see who I was fighting. Then this fog receded all the way to the horizon, and I still couldn't see anyone. And then in a moment, I suddenly realised I had created all this destruction, all this devastation. I had created fighting myself. There was never anyone else to fight. I had always been fighting myself. I tried to throw that double-edged sword away, and I couldn't. I couldn't throw it away. It was a part of me. It was like it was there, and I couldn't get rid of it. And then all of a sudden, I woke up and I was sitting on the park bench again. And right next to me were those drugs and alcohol in the haversack. And I looked at them, and I looked at the river, and I looked at the sky, and the trees, and the birds. And I made a commitment to myself right there and then. And that commitment was, I will do whatever I have to do not to be the person that I am sitting here today. In that instant, I got up and I walked away, and I left that haversack there. I've never had a drug, a drink of alcohol, or a cigarette since that day. But I thought all the challenges were behind me. No. The biggest ones were ahead of me. The biggest challenges were ahead of me, but they weren't dark challenges. They weren't about pain or depression or anger or hatred. These were new challenges. These were challenges about, how do I be a good person? How do I build a new character for myself? How do I find role models to build on what I would like to be like? And so these became the big challenges of the future. Studying things like a nursery rhyme, understanding a nursery rhyme, using nursery rhymes to control my mind when my mind was out of control and I couldn't control what the thinking was, using a nursery rhyme to bring it back as a mantra to calm my mind down. It's a technique I developed myself. By that time, people still wouldn't communicate with me. In the soup kitchens, they used to call me Charles Manson because I was angry. I was so angry. Nobody would come near me. And I was aware of that. And there was a bit of a secular issue here because I would get angry because no one would talk to me, but I understood that no one would talk to me because I was so angry. So this became a dilemma that I had to try and work out. I was quite cognizant of my behaviour. And I allowed myself the luxury of some things because, I was giving up alcohol, cigarettes, cocaine, marijuana, amphetamine. I allowed myself a few little luxuries, like I was allowed to be grumpy. I was allowed to be mean as long as I didn't hurt anyone. But there were certain things I had to do. For example, I had to do one good thing for a person every day, and they weren't to know about it. And that could have been as simple as a smile or a good morning, I hope you do have a good day. I did that not for them, although I do hope they benefited from it, but that was more about me practicing to do something that was worthwhile that I didn't necessarily like to do. So this was a very subtle, nuanced way of changing my habits. After I'd sort of established a little bit of stability, and I use that word very loosely in my life. I was still homeless, but the goss in the soup kitchens were that computers were the way of the future. This is 2000, sort of around the turn of the millennium, and computers are the way of the future. I thought, well, okay, I better get on this wave and ride it. I want to learn about computers. So I signed myself up for a 6-week computer course, hardware computer course. I didn't distinguish between hardware and software. A hardware computer course at Kingscliff TAFE. It was free, so it was in the right price range. So I started attending that. I think it was 2 nights a week. After the first night, I hated it. Absolutely hated it. Decided on the spot that I didn't like computers, but also at the same time realised that incompletion was a big part of my life, had been a really big part of my life up until that point. So completing this course became the major project. It was a major priority. No matter what, be there at the end. So I committed. It wasn't about like or dislike. It was about being there at the end. And I was. So I stuck it out and I was there at the end. And I got my little piece of paper to say that I was there at the end, and I was so proud of that little piece of paper. The first, little stepping stone to it, was an achievement. After that, the ego sort of kicked in a little bit, and I thought, I really enjoyed that learning process. I think I'd like to go and do the school certificate. Back to that seed, back to that central idea that education is important. And I approached a couple of TAFEs in New South Wales, and they basically said that they don't do the school certificate any longer. But there was a TAFE in Queensland that did a similar course, but the qualifications were higher. And again, testing my ego, qualifications higher, I want to do it. I go down and get into the chauffeur-driven Mercedes, and go all the way up to Southport. That's a bus. So I'm into the chauffeur-driven Mercedes up to Southport, and I hop out and I go into the administration at Southport TAFE, present myself there, ask them if there's a course that they do there that's equivalent to the school certificate, only better. Think about it. And they, of course, they're scratching their heads wondering what I'm talking about. And suddenly, someone says, oh, the tertiary preparation course. The only word I really, well, two words, I suppose. I understood preparation because you do that for your meals, and course. And I kind of understood that. The tertiary bit, I had no idea. And I said, yeah, that's it. I said, I'd like to sign up for that. When does it start? And as it turned out, it started in about 6 weeks or something. Anyway, and they said, that'll cost you so many dollars. Oh, I don't have that sort of money. I said, how about if I pay it off? And they looked at me and they went out the back and got another admin person to come in, and we had a bit of a chat and reached an agreement. Yep, so I would go in every Monday morning at 8:30 a.m, pay my $21, and they would teach me for the week. So that sounded like a good deal to me. And I did that for 9.5, nearly 10 months. I was homeless all the way through it. I learnt a lot going through that process. There was one point I got so angry with computers, I picked it up and I was about to throw it out the window. And there was this little voice behind me and it just simply said, Gregory, do you think that's a good idea? That was enough to bring me back into that reality, because I still had that ability to disassociate and not be in me. And so I gently put the computer back down and we had a bit of a smile over that. I think that was about the last that I recall of a real rage that I'd had, was that moment. I graduated from that course and I got a very special award. I got to meet the mayor of the Gold Coast as a graduation thing. And then which wasn't on my radar at the time, but I was asked which university I'd like to go to. And I'm thinking, what university? Tertiary, it's just starting to register. And there's a funny story in the background there as well, because before I actually went to the TAFE, I was sitting on the Tweed River eating some chips from a very famous fish and chip shop. And there was construction going on across the road. And I hadn't had a drink or a drug for quite a while. Anyway, I got up, walked over, and I said to these guys, what are you building? And they said, a university. And I said, oh. And I walked away and I thought, I'd like to go there one day. And back to the central story, when I was choosing which university I wanted to go to, I had no idea what universities were. But the one word that kept jumping out at me was sociology, very similar to sociopath. And when I looked up the definition of sociology, it said the study of society. And I thought, yeah, that's what I want to do. I want to study society. I want to understand why I hate society so much. So I chose the university based on that. Yeah. And as it turned out, it was Southern Cross University in the social sciences. At that university, or that campus that they were building that day, that I walked across the road and asked, and so I ended up there. I have a photo of it. What happened was I started studying up at the Tweed Heads campus of Southern Cross, and there was something happened up there, and I enrolled in a HR course, and all of a sudden I realised what HR meant, and I didn't want to do that. So I'm sort of trying to strategically build pathways out of there and into other coursework. And the only other major that I could go into was community development, but that was on the Coffs Harbour campus. So one of the advantages of being homeless and having no roots around, I said I could go down there this afternoon. So I caught a bus down to Coffs Harbour, enrolled in the Coffs Harbour Southern Cross, and I've been there ever since. I got towards the end of my undergrad, and about a month before completion, I had a tutor, lecturer tutor, who graded one of my papers, and I mean this was a tough market. She was renowned. I got a HD, and she rang me up. She said to me, "Would you like to do some marking for me?" I sort of, I hadn't thought it. I didn't think of it in terms of work. I just heard, "Do you want to do some marking?" I think, "Well, I don't really have time." It's like, I've got my own work I've got to do. And then she said, she told me, how much I'd be paid for that. And then, I'd be on the payroll. I'm thinking, a job? Yeah, I want a job. So I agreed to that, but there was a condition. There's always a condition with these things. You got to read the fine print. The condition was that I go on and I do an honours. Now, I didn't know what an honours was, so she had to explain that to me. But I agreed because okay. So all of a sudden, I'm not, picking apples out of an orchard or, digging trenches, sweeping floors, washing dishes, all of the normal jobs that I have. All of a sudden, I've got this prestigious university job. So that sounded good, and I was, okay, I'll do it. So I allowed myself to be mentored while I'm doing my honours. And there's a funny thing about my honours, because you get to do it on just about anything you like and choose your own topic, which confused me. And I spoke to someone about what I should do my honours on, and they said, "Why don't you do it on yourself?" That was a little bit too much for me. The compromise was that I would do it on with 5 people that were in the same orphanage that I was in. So I went and I found 5 people that experienced the same orphanage that I was in, and I did a hermeneutic phenomenological study on their experience of St Patrick's Orphanage in Armidale. That went off and was examined. The examiner report from Newcastle came back, and the first line was, "This thesis has changed my view of life forever." I achieved a first class honours, and I'd had a couple of publications while I was doing that. So all of a sudden I found myself in a situation where I was being encouraged to apply for a postgraduate award scholarship. And I'm thinking, I'm a fraud. I can't do this. This is all too much. But I had very good feminist mentors, really strong mentors, and they wouldn't take no for an answer. And I applied for the APA, and I got it very comfortably. So I found myself working full-time for Southern Cross in the social sciences, doing a PhD full time, as well as mentoring and a few other things, which was great. One of the benefits of my undergrad, especially the sociology majors that I did, I learned about me. I learned more about me than society. Understanding society was really good. But what I learned was how do people fit in. Yeah, Irving Goffman's work, especially George Herbert Mead, some really good theorists that really impacted me quite significantly. And what I realised was society was just a functioning organism, but it was me. It was me being the wrong shape to fit in, and I had to change the shape that I was. I had to change the way that I thought. In learning to change who I was and how I interacted with society, I was suddenly realizing that it's okay to be different as well, and that I did have some abilities that were considered to be valuable, of value within a society. The way I thought was very different to the way a lot of people think, and most people think. And that especially came to the fore during my TAFE course, because towards the end of that, I wanted to go and do a stats exam to qualify to get into the university. And my tutors at the time strongly advised against it, saying that it wouldn't be a very good idea for me to go and do that. I ignored their advice and I went and did it anyway. And when my results from the stats test came back, I was a very lowly 3%. I was absolutely devastated. The results of this test supported the idea that I was stupid and an idiot, and I really didn't have a future. Anyway, I very humbly took this piece of paper to show my tutors and saying, there's no point in going on. In a very paternalistic way, they sort of chuckled and patted me on the shoulder saying, don't worry, it's, these types of tests are not meant for people like you. You think differently to most people. So don't put any credence in those results. Believe us when we say you are good enough to get into university. These were very good people who saw the value of what that was buried in me, and they provided more fertilizer for those seeds that were planted. And so although not ready for harvest yet, the ideas were growing, the maturity was happening. After I'd secured the scholarship, I needed to sit down and start to design my PhD. I was stepping out a little bit, like I was gaining a little bit of confidence, and I just wanted to sort of step out of the box a little bit, sort of perhaps be a little bit controversial, just say, look, this is a part of reality that people refuse to look at. So I designed it again with a hermeneutic phenomenological methodology. I strongly believe that was the best methodology for that particular project at the time, because it was focusing on lived experience. It was focusing on each person's expertise of their own experience and their interpretation of that experience, which is undisputable. You cannot argue that a person's own experience. So I wanted to put that in there. But what happened for me during that process was, and there were different levels of trauma involved. And I mean, I tried very hard to mitigate wherever possible any damage. But one of the things I realised was that I'd been told often, I was told often, quite literally in these words, that I hide my light under the bushel. I had no idea what that meant. What are you talking about? I had no idea. Today I understand it. It's actually the hermit in the tarot deck, and it has a very significant meaning. I've investigated that, but that metaphor became important to me while I was going through my PhD, because listening to people's stories, I made a decision. And that decision was that if ever I was asked about my story going forward, I was not going to hide it any longer. If I was ever asked about my story, I would tell it the way it was. No more of this, playing it down, pretending it wasn't that bad or anything else. So it was just the way it was. Yeah. And I was going to do that in honour of all these people that contributed to my PhD. I completed my PhD late, it was December 2015. It was examined in 2016. I had a couple of typos, which was kind of disappointing. It wasn't long after that, only a couple of weeks after that, I was approached by the dean of the, at the time, if I would, she'd heard that I worked quite a lot with disadvantaged people, and she wanted to put a program together to help disadvantaged people get some qualification, whether that be a diploma level or whatever. And I said, yeah, look, I'm too pleased to be a part of that. She said, that was in Lismore. She approached me and I was going back to Coffs the next day. She said, I'll send our media person in to have a quick interview with you and we'll see where it goes. And I said, okay. So the next day, I was in my office and Bridget comes in and she said, the head of schools asked me to have an interview with you. Can I ask you some questions? I said, sure. And her first question was around, well, what were you doing when you first enrolled in university? So I started to answer that question. Well, I was living in the sand dunes out the back of, and I started going into it, and she's looking there, and I looked at her and I thought, I'm traumatising this poor lady. And she said to me, this is too much for me. This is too big. She said, do you mind if I go and make a phone call? And I thought, okay, yeah, not a problem. She said, I'll get back to you. I said, okay. So she left, and about 20 minutes, half hour later, I received a phone call. And the phone call was from the producer at ABC, Richard Feidler. All of a sudden, I realised what she meant, it's too big for me. And Michelle, I think her name was, yeah. And she asked me a couple of questions, and she said, I've just been speaking with Bridget, and she says you may have a story we might be interested in. And she said, do you mind if I ask you a couple of questions? I said, sure, shoot. Anyway, she asked me a couple of questions, and she asked me one question, and she said, look, we'll have a production person down there in a couple of days to have a chat with you. June that year, it was 10 a.m. on the 22nd of June, I think it was. That program went to air. It's had over nearly 2 million hits, I think. So it's, but now that program went for 46 minutes, I think it was. On the 26th minute, according to my inbox, I'd already had 3 global publishers approach me for a biography, and I deleted them all. So I wasn't in that headspace. I didn't understand. I was very naive of everything that was happening around me. I was still just this fraud that, this imposter that was trying the best I could to do the best job I could. And that's all I wanted, was a good job. I was on a pathway that I'd never been on before, and that was a pathway of a respectable position, a reasonable income with accountability, and I didn't have to go and clock on every morning and clock off every morning. And one of the things that used to annoy me the most when I was in a labouring situation or something, and I'd do something, and somebody would come up to you and say, "Well, why did you do that?" I said, "Well, I thought it'd be a good idea." You're not paid to think, and all of a sudden I'm paid to think, and I'm loving it, and it's a whole different paradigm. It's a whole different life experience for me. About 8 weeks after I deleted those emails, a lady from Penguin House rang me, and she said, "Did you get my email?" I said, "Look, I work in a university. I get a lot of emails." Anyway, she explained herself, and I said, "Look, I'm not interested. I'm busy. I just don't have that sort of time." Anyway, during the conversation, I said this, "Look, I don't want to, I've done enough reading of people with lived experience like mine to know that there's a lot of dark books sitting on the shelves collecting dust. I don't want another one to go up there with them, with my name on it." And she listened to what I had to say, and part of what I had to say is, look, I struggle, I struggle to, well, at the time I was, keep my car on the road, so, she said to me, "Look, do you mind if we don't close this conversation off?" She said, "I'll give you a ring in a couple of weeks, and, we could have a bit of a conversation then." And I said, "Sure." She was a nice enough lady. I didn't want to upset her. Anyway, to her words, she rang me on the day that she said she would. And she said, I heard what you said to me in that last phone call." She said, "and I think I've got an answer to each of those points that you made. You said you don't have time to write a book. How about if we get a ghostwriter for you?" I didn't know what a ghostwriter was. She had to explain that. She said, "You say you don't want another dark book on the shelf." She said, "Well, I've had some discussions, and we just happen to think that you do have a bit of a sense of humour." And I said, "Well, it can't be too much of a sense of humour, because I tried to sell it for meals often, and I couldn't even get a decent meal for it." And then she addressed every point that I had. And then she offered me some money for it, and I said, "No, I don't want to do it." So she doubled the money. And I said, "Well, you really do want this, don't you? Let me think about it." 8 months later, after backwards and forwards and negotiations and that, I signed the contract. It became an international seller. It's used in universities as a social work text, not just in Australia, but places like Brazil, the US. I'm very humbled by it. It helps people, and that's a good thing. Yeah, the book was published in 2018, and it's a constant conversation wherever I go. I'm a director on the board of the End Street Sleeping Collaboration in New South Wales. They approached me on the basis of the book. In that role, I've been asked to form a subcommittee of lived expertise. So I'm in the process of putting together a very specialised group of people that have had lived experience in our out-of-home care, corrective systems, mental health, Indigenous persons, elders. So I feel very privileged that I've been provided with the resources to be able to put such a powerful group of people together with a seat at the Premier's table. This is in addressing Gladys Berejiklian's agreement to be a vanguard state to end homelessness by 2030, or to end rough sleeping by 2030. Initially, there were 14 cities around the world. Gladys Berejiklian was approached to have Sydney as one of the vanguard states, and she refused to have Sydney. She said, "No, I won't have one city. I will sign the whole state up." New South Wales became the first vanguard state in the world. The End Street Sleeping Collaboration was formed as an entity to assist in meeting those obligations. The publication plays a really important role in opening doors to have conversations on out-of-home care. But it's not just the book, it's the experience contained within the book. And I guess to an extent, my accomplishments since the book as well. I'm doing what I've set out to do 22 years ago. And I made a decision when I walked away from that park bench that, the most important thing I could do in a day is get out of bed each morning, do the best I can each day without hurting anyone, including myself, going to bed of a night, reflecting on my day and trying to understand what I can do better. When I reflect on my life, and if I was presented with an opportunity to say something to that 10-year-old, understanding that 10-year-old wouldn't care what I said and probably wouldn't even listen to what I had to say, what I would say is, you're going to go through a lot of pain. Life's going to be miserable for a long time. Trust in the universe, because one day a door will open and you'll be the only person in the whole world that sees that door open. And you'll go through that. And when you do, the most amazing things will happen. Just make sure you're alive to see it. For kids in care today, it's difficult to make predictions, but I would so strongly encourage them to give themselves every opportunity. Don't run from the pain, because the pain is something that helps shape us. Just be aware that one day, when it all seems too much and you can't do it anymore, there is another door you can go through. Look for that door, because it's through that door your life will change. What tomorrow brings, this is one of the beautiful things about life. I don't need to know. The only thing I need to know is what's in my diary for tomorrow. Life is a beautiful thing, and I mean, now I've been gifted with a beautiful son, so that's very special. And of course, to be gifted with a beautiful son has a big story around it as well, because there has to be a very special woman in your life. All of a sudden, I feel whole and complete. I have a family. I have a position in my world. I'm respected in my world. For all those days when I spoke and no one heard me, today when I speak, people listen.